as we do.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Always proud to rise in this House and represent the people of Timmins, James Bay. I'll be sharing my time with the member for Elmwood Strathcona. I find in the 14 years I've been here a dismal, dismal state of discussion on the greatest crisis of our time, the environmental crisis. There's a great book called The Great Derangement, as though people don't seem to have the ability to come to terms and discuss what's actually happening to our planet when we see it all around us. I see it with the Conservatives today. I see it with the Liberals today, who went to Paris and took such beautiful photos of themselves and made such beautiful expressions of change. And that what we've seen is that under their plan, carbon emissions did go down by 1.4%, which is a rounding figure. It may go up again next year. There is no coherent plan from this government to meet those targets. Just as with the previous government, there were no coherent plans. Because in the fundamental area, over the last 10 years, under oil and gas has risen. The upstream emissions have raised 47%. Transportation up over 11%. So for all the other efficiencies we try to find, we in Canada are not meeting a coherent strategy. And so I'm going to talk a bit about some of the incoherent strategies that have been put forward in my time here, and then talk about some of the ways we need to move forward. You know, I remember when I was here in 2004, 2005, you know, the Liberal plan, Liberal had a great plan. We were going to meet all our Kyoto targets. We were going to diminish greenhouse gases easily. And what was the plan? It was called voluntary emissions. Well, I was just newly elected, so the idea that you had voluntary emissions standards struck me as one of the most ridiculous things I ever heard. But, you know, Stéphane Dion, a man I greatly respect, said, no, you must understand that voluntary emissions, when we work with industry, they'll do the right thing. Well, for crying out loud, Speaker, I come from mining country. Inco never cleaned up the mess in Sudbury without legislated standards. That's how you clean up the environment. And mining companies that I've dealt with over the years, you know, it used to be perfectly legal to just, as in my backyard, just take the waste and dump it in a lake because it was the cheapest solution. And all over my little town of Cobalt, we have these beautiful green beaches, which 100 years later you still can't swim in. And then someone said, you know, to the mining companies, you're not going to be able to just dump arsenic and cyanide into the waters. You're going to have to set up proper tailing dams. And of course, we heard from them, just like we hear from the Conservative backbench today, oh my God, you're going to kill efficiencies. Oh my God, you're going to chase business all around the world and they'll leave. Well, they didn't leave. And the mining sector became more efficient and more profitable. Just as the oil and gas sector will become more efficient and more profitable when they actually have to meet these legislated targets. We have another one, which is cap and trade. Now, people have been trying to explain cap and trade to me for years, and I know there's a lot of brainiacs out there who understand the ins and outs of cap and trade. But the idea that if you have a whole bunch of non-polluting people and they can sell credits to polluters, the world will somehow be a better place, always struck me as sort of like selling sobriety credits on the highway. You know that if you have 15 sober drivers and one drunk driver, if that one drunk driver can buy sobriety credits from all the sober drivers, overall, statistically, I agree, I'm not an economist, but if I was an economist, you will see a graph that will show overall sobriety on the roads will actually rise. Yeah, you could do that, or you could just say to the drunk, it's time to sober up. And I think that this has been the problem, is we've always been trying to find schemes to deal with the fact that we actually have reached a limit for carbon. And when you reach that limit for carbon, we are now into the Anthropocene, where our traditional relationship with nature has been upended. And the costs that we're starting to see from flooding, from fires, from droughts, from freezes, has becoming more and more of a serious economic issue. And so I am certainly more than willing to share the numbers on whatever the carbon pricing is going to be, but I'd also like to start seeing some serious numbers on what is happening in terms of our overall economy that's being hit by increasingly unstable weather. Because we are now what they call in the period of another great acceleration. And if anybody who's got gray hair like me remembers, how often did we hear on the radio 25 years ago and 30 years ago about entire cities under threat from weather? And we've seen a number of cities seriously damaged. We are in a different era, my friends. And Canada has been the laggard on this. In fact, what Canada has been is Canada has been very sanctimonious on this without taking the steps forward. And you know, I come from blue-collar, natural resource-based communities. And the people that you need at the table when you're talking about what an economic environmental plan must include, you have to have the workers there at the table. We don't throw a generation of workers under the bus. The only political entity that ever did that was Margaret Thatcher, and the damage that was done to the UK we're still feeling today. These issues of transition and building a new economy are essential, because you don't get environmental justice without economic justice. The two of them go hand in hand. And I had the great honor last year in Edmonton of meeting with the IBEW workers in Edmonton, who are training their own employees, the IBEW workers who work in Fort Mac, who work in Fort St. John, who work in the Patch. They're actually setting up training because they see the potential for new economies of energy. In fact, one of the IBEW workers said to me, he said, you know, when Prime Minister Harper talked about an energy superpower, he was right. He was just talking about the wrong energy. Because the greatest single source of solar power in the world today is South Central Alberta. The potential to transform our economy through the natural geography of the prairies in a solar and wind economy is immense. And of course, you know, the Flat Earth Society, my friends on the backbench of the Conservative Party will say, oh, that's tilting at windmills. Yeah, there are windmills there too. But you look at other countries like Germany that have moved far ahead of us. You even see China is starting to move far ahead of us. And they talk about the economy, and they talk about efficiencies, and they talk about jobs. When you start to talk about the renewable economy that is passing Canada by, because we are still defiantly defending the typewriter when everyone else is moving into the cell phone age, Canada needs to pick up. And I would say to my colleagues in the Liberal Party that they have talked the talk, but they have not met the aggressive targets we need. We will not meet the Paris Accords. That has been found in numerous studies, government studies alone. And so to get there, we need to establish a couple of common principles. We have to establish a legislated limit on carbon. Once we've established a legislated limit, we then have to say, how do we start to diminish? And that's where we can start talking about subsidies and start to work with industry on meeting the efficiencies. But we have to have a solid limit that we don't go above. And I refer you to the United Kingdom, Mr. Speaker, and Scotland, where they established a national carbon budget, where these countries were extreme laggards on meeting their greenhouse gas emissions, and they are well on target now to meet their economic and environmental targets on renewables because they had a coherent national response. They had a focus on how they were going to deal with areas where they had the highest levels of GHGs and start to move it down. You need a coherent response. The idea that we can do this voluntarily or simply by putting a price on carbon and hope it'll all get there, we're not going to get where we need to be, Mr. Speaker. And I'll tell you, after 14 years in the House, to see the degradation of our planet that's happened in that time while this House has produced talk and not action is shameful on all of us. It is upon us to start saying that this crisis is real and to start moving with the urgency that is needed. and to recognize that there are incredible potentials if we start to actually move towards efficiencies rather than the same old 20th century vision that we've now outgrown. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.